So this is going to be the end of this first chunk of core debates. I hope to have a lot more. But this is about the individual versus the community. And the core debate here is just, can someone prioritize themselves at the cost of the greater community or the quote unquote common good? Sample motions would include, this House believes that developing countries should tax migration to developed countries. So basically, heavily limiting someone's ability to move because maybe you don't want brain drain or other things. This House regrets the premium placed on family. So is it okay that you're giving up and sacrificing so much for your family rather than what I would assume Gov would run here, a more individualistic world where you would have more of a premium on yourself and your own development? Last, this House mandate boosters for COVID-19. So it's a question of, like giving up someone's bodily autonomy in a sense, saying that they have to get a shot, but at the same time, forcing them to be able to protect the larger community as a whole from a deadly disease. I think one of the less intuitive sample motions here, and I guess one of the core differences between second and third wave feminism, is a question of, um, are there choices that women can make that are empowering for them personally, but perhaps bad for women as a whole? When second wave feminists might say yes, and third wave feminists might say no. So, for example, this house regrets beauty pageants. You could make the argument that some women find this empowering, but other people would make the argument that this actually contributes to perhaps the objectification of women, to building Eurocentric standards of beauty, to associating beauty as one of the you know prize factors of women when these are arbitrary characteristics often assigned at birth, etc. Same applies to things like being conservative. Can you choose to be conservative? Is that a decision that um, the feminist movement should allow and should be supportive of? Or, for example, discouraging the use of makeup. So I guess this is, I think, much more controversial than the other two. But a question of, should the feminist movement support, I guess, the artificial altering of one's face when a lot of the companies are still male run, when this method could possibly pander to male standards of beauty, again, Eurocentric standards of beauty, etc. And so it's a question of, are these individual decisions empowering? And even if they are they beneficial for the community at large? So the first thing you want to ask is there an obligation that exists for the individual to their community? To what extent does this exist? So I think the first thing you could ask is, has the community empowered this individual to choose this to begin with? Have they, maybe, for example, I think in the developing country example, I'd say that this person owes the state because the state probably paid in some sense, or allowed for their education, allowed them to develop such that they are desired in other countries, particularly in competitive developed country job markets, etc. So does that have some kind of reciprocal responsibility on both sides? Second is, do they have a special responsibility to their community precisely because of the role that they take on? So I'd say politicians are not like other citizens. They have a special obligation because of the fact that they were elected to their constituents, and thus they can't, do things for their own. They can't be corrupt. And similarly, parents to their families, they had made the active decision to bring a child into the world, and therefore they should live up to that kind of responsibility. And so, in general, I think there's a question of, does the individual owe the community anything? And to some extent, they probably do. It's just a matter of, is the action in question part of their set of responsibilities? Next is, you want to assess the privilege of the individual. So sometimes you can only make choices because you are from a particular position where you can make that choice. And so there are many questions to ask here. One, does this decision come from an advantageous position? If so, why? What allowed them to make that decision? Following from that, does that decision, or does the decision harm others um, within this group of people? So what I'm trying to say here is, when you make that decision, is it going to harm a less privileged group of individuals, and therefore is not something you should be able to do? Otherwise, it might not be very fair if some certain groups of people can decide like what is beneficial for them is okay if it comes at the cost of many more groups of people, of more vulnerable groups of people. Last is, can everybody access the ability to prioritize themselves? So maybe you want to believe that there's a right for people to choose and protect themselves, when that might not be the case. Going back to the migration motion, I'd make the argument that um, most of the people who decide to migrate are skilled and therefore maybe had some kind of wealth to begin with, are fairly privileged individuals, and that's why they want to leave. And I make that argument because I will say this will have a negative impact on the country's economy, and therefore people who had no choice to like leave or stay will be stuck in a worse off situation than they were before, or when those people could have stayed instead. So assessing the privilege of the individual and asking, is this a choice everyone can make? And if not, does that choice harm certain groups of people when they make that choice? There's also just the question of the extent of the benefit, so just normal cost benefit analysis stuff. Is the benefit to the community greater than the collected sacrifice from these individuals? So if everyone gave up a certain freedom or something they wanted to do, is it worth it? Is it going to be greater than like perhaps just a very small benefit to the community instead? There's also a question of, are there alternative sources for the community to access these benefits? So I'd say something like, again, using the migration motion as like, I guess, the main example for this video, I'd make the argument that for skilled work, you could also have migrants enter your country. And so it's fine. We don't have to tax them. In fact, we can get a lot of benefit from allowing migration as well into our country to get those skilled workers. So now it's just a matter of making sure that people who want to leave can actually leave. Third, does the decision prevent others from making such a decision? So you want to ask yourself, if you make this decision, does it put the rest of the community in a place where it becomes difficult to make that decision for themselves as well? Going back to this, especially if it's a privileged individual, that might mean that lesser privileged individuals might not be in the same state of privilege that would allow them to prioritize themselves. Next, does the decision to do this encourage others to make this decision? And does such a compounding problem make the problem worse? So what I mean by this is, let's say the motion is this house would ban operations that alter one's physical appearance. I would say, when people continue to do this, and many people do this, the people who haven't done this will be pressured to do this. Because everyone looks whiter, everyone has much more Eurocentric features, everyone has certain face structure and face shape. And there are many countries with that kind of culture. I think in Korea, for example, there's a very strong culture of surgery. Whereas maybe if no one had done it, you wouldn't have wanted to do it. But because everyone's done it, you feel ugly, you don't feel comfortable in your own skin, and you feel pressured to do it as a consequence. Similarly, this house would restrict rural to urban migration. If people leave from rural areas to urban areas for work, now companies will see rural areas and think, I can't get anyone here to do work, and so we will never enter. And thus, more jobs, or rather, less jobs are available, and everyone within that rural area would now be forced and pressured to want to move to the urban area. So does it cause a kind of cyclical problem that might make it harder and harder insofar as more people are opting into it? I'm going to end with collective action problems. And in essence, what they are is just, sometimes there are things that if everyone did them, it would be good. But if even just a few individuals don't want to do them, maybe because the immediate decision to not do them has a more short-term benefit, then everyone is kind of screwed. So take, for example, actions on the climate. I personally think that everyone would benefit from significant actions to reduce climate change, right? Both in terms of the environmental damage that would exist, but also I think there are strong economic incentives because of the greater efficiency that climate change like action requires for this to occur. However, reducing the impact of climate change would require a lot of opt-in from a vast majority of the world's countries. But if some countries don't opt in, what happens is, for the ones that do opt in, they lose out economically, but they also don't do enough to solve the climate crisis. So when trying to solve climate change, you'll probably spend more on investment, you'll probably spend more on trying to go green, and that only really pays off if all the countries end up trying to fight climate change, because climate change requires a very global effort. And because of that, now countries don't end up opting in. So there's this choice problem of if everyone does it, we're good. But if some people start not doing it, other people decide to start not doing it, and now nobody's doing it. And so you have to assess. Sometimes you have to force people to make a decision that is better for the community because it is also better for them individually. But once someone makes that selfish decision, it is bad for everybody else in that instance. So that ends this first part. I have quite a few more conceptualized and in mind. I'll hopefully be uploading them in a few months, most likely. So thank you so much.